moving on to Lulu, whose plot and backstory is closely interconnected with Waka's, she exemplifies someone who, rather than resigning themselves to faith in a higher power, to both rationalise and cope with loss, she takes to internalizing it in a very extreme way. Various hints are given throughout the game that Lulu adopted her internalized reserve and kind of cynical demeanor only since, Chapu's death. And I think we can assume that she adopted the quasi-goth attire as an outward display of mourning too, much like in the real-world traditions in continental Western Europe and South America, which is in part inspired by Catholicism again. So again, we see these kind of real-world traditions of faith at play in Final Fantasy as well. Until Auron's arrival, Lulu is posited as the voice of reason and the not leader, but certainly the wizened element to Yuna's party. She's remarkably pragmatic, but also in her own way remarkably sensitive and naive. Her blunt refusal to discuss Chapu, dispels this idea of her being strong, and actually posits her as a remarkably pained and damaged person. On the surface, she seems like a counterbalance to Waka by being logical and resourceful, but scratching below, the surface, we can see she's in precisely the same grief-stricken turmoil as Waka. She's just dealing with it in a very different way that makes it less obvious. And it is this looming grief that makes Waka and Lulu so interconnected, and in every conversation between them, there's a sort of elephant in the room that is much more than the memory of Chapu, but it is also the unconfronted grief that comes with that, which of course later manifests itself into a romantic resolve, between them both. So, despite being positioned as someone wise and strong, Lulu caters to this caricature of the buxom woman, to put in one way, much like Tifa from Final Fantasy VII or Beatrix from Final Fantasy IX. And as I mentioned, Yuna, I discussed Yuna briefly from a feminist perspective, and I think it's prudent to mention that Lulu's aesthetics are completely in contrast to this, in that she dresses much less conservatively than Yuna, and I'm sure if anyone wanted to analyse this game from such an angle, there'd be questions around whether she's a liberated woman, kind of dressing how she wants, or perhaps someone who's clearly been designed by a male game developer, and thus a product of a patriarchal, idealised version of what an accessible woman should be. For my part, I'm not going to stray into that, but I think off the back of this, it's also worth noting that there are a couple of dialogue options available in the game where Tidus is able to flirt with Lulu, and this is quite a funny kind of tongue-in-cheek addition that harkens back to the ability in Final Fantasy VII to court the emotions of both Tifa and Ares and actually go on a date with one of them.